They sent ammo to men they valued and left us to die with empty hands. I didn't grasp the truth of it until the moment my lasgun's final charge bled into the mud, hissing faintly as if mocking my surprise. The trench wall shuddered from another impact, sending showers of wet soil across my visor. The world smelled of iron and old rain, of burned propellant and bodies cooling beneath the churned earth. I remember gripping the weapon tighter even after it fell silent, as though pressure alone could force one more shot from its exhausted core. It couldn't. We had given all we had, and more. Our world was a mire of fog and mud and smoke, the sky a low, suffocating ceiling of ash. The Chaos cultists came in waves screaming mad hymns, their silhouettes jagged against the phosphor glare. They were men once, but the madness had hollowed them out and filled the space with frenzy. Their rounds stitched the trench lip, cracking the boards above my head. Keren cried out somewhere to my right, high, thin, and terrified. Voss cursed as his heavy bolter hammered empty, the belt clicking uselessly through its feed. And I Sergeant Rannick Hale pressed the vox bead closer to my mouth, tasting blood as I forced the words out through my cracked lips. Command, this is Orison Squad. Line is holding, but ammunition is dry. Request immediate. The vox dissolved into static, a harsh shriek that stabbed through my helmet. I tried again. Command, repeat, ammo dry. We cannot maintain. A brief whisper cut through the interference, like a cold breath against the ear. Stand by. Orison Squad. Maintain position. Maintain position. That was all. No resupply. No reinforcement. I swallowed hard, forcing myself to believe that maybe the rest would follow, that a crate of lasbacks was already rattling its way across the mud toward us, that someone, somewhere, still cared whether we held or fell. Hope is a stubborn thing. It survives in the cracks even when everything else rots. A shell landed close enough to rattle my teeth. Keren stumbled into me, face streaked with mud and fear. He was barely old enough to grow a proper beard, yet the trenches had carved new lines into him, thin, trembling lines that hadn't been there just weeks before. Sarge, they're coming again. His voice quivered. The boy's hands shook so violently his bayonet glinted in useless arcs. I see them, I muttered, my breath steamed in the cold. Hold steady. Voss slammed his empty bolter against the trench wall with a roar of frustration. Emperor, damn it, they leave us with nothing. Ralvan, ever the calm backbone, placed a steadying hand on Voss's shoulder. We hold. We always hold. His tone was level, but even he couldn't hide the flicker of dread in his eyes. The next volley from the cultists tore apart the trench lip. Mud splashed over us in thick waves, mixed with the copper tang of someone's blood. I couldn't tell whose. The air vibrated with unending gunfire and the distant thunder of artillery. We were a single strand in a massive, fraying rope, and each second, another fiber snapped. My hand drifted to the single spare magazine at my belt, the last one I hadn't fired yet. I hesitated. I could save it for myself, for Keren, for a moment that might matter. But the truth was simple. One magazine wouldn't change what was coming. It would only delay the inevitable. That was when the first vision hit me. For a heartbeat, the smoke parted, and I saw corpses stacked like sandbags along the trenchmen in our uniforms, eyes open and staring. They didn't accuse. They simply watched, silent, waiting for us to join them. The world snapped back as another round smacked into the wooden brace above me. I jolted, breath ragged, vision blurred, and for the first time since this war began, I felt something colder than fear. I felt forgotten. The cultists' war cries rolled across the fog like a tide of broken glass, each shout jagged, uneven, stitched together by madness. But behind their noise, behind the thunder of distant artillery and the hiss of lasfire dying in the mud, I heard something else, something far more brutal. It was the sound of a world grinding its teeth beneath the weight of a war it never asked for. A world that had already chosen who it would bury. They told us this planet rebelled over tithes, that its people refused the Emperor's due, that heretics stirred beneath the surface, whispering ruin into willing ears. Maybe that was true, maybe it wasn't. All I knew was that when we arrived, The trenches were already carved deep into the earth, and the air tasted like old rust and wet ash. The kind of place where hope didn't grow, only graves. Ralvan said it reminded him of home. I tried not to think about what that meant. In the brief lull between attacks, we gathered close beneath the collapsed brace, trying to make ourselves smaller targets beneath the cracked timber. Voss sat with his back against the mud wall, staring at his heavy bolter like it had personally betrayed him. Karen knelt opposite, hands wrapped tight around his bayonet, knuckles white beneath the grime. He rocked slightly, as though holding himself together by motion alone. Ralvan crouched beside me, voice low. "You got anything back from command?" I shook my head. "Just that we're to maintain position." His sigh was long, heavy, meaning, "Die here." I didn't respond because the truth was already sitting between us, like another soldier, silent, grim, inevitable. The Imperium didn't waste ammunition on men like us. We weren't the first line, we weren't the last. We were simply the ones closest to the enemy when supplies failed. We spent the lull pretending we weren't listening to the sounds coming from the next trench over the screams, the wet impacts, the gunfire that stuttered and died, one weapon at a time. Karen covered his ears. Voss muttered curses under his breath. Ralvan stared at the trench wall like he could see through it, counting the seconds until the next wave. I felt a strange calm settle over me, the kind that comes when the body is too exhausted to fear the inevitable. My fingers traced the dented plate of my chest armor, the one Karen had clumsily hammered straight days earlier. He'd laughed, then an awkward, hopeful sound that felt like a crime now. "You think we'll make it out?" he whispered suddenly, voice barely carrying over the distant thunder. I didn't answer at first. The lie sat heavy on my tongue. He waited. He believed I could give him something real. "We'll get through this," I said. My voice didn't shake. That was the cruel part, I sounded sure. Karen nodded quickly, as if afraid the hope would vanish if he didn't accept it fast enough. "Good. I just needed to hear it." Ralvan's eyes met mine. He didn't call it out, didn't question it. He just gave a small, tired nod, the kind men share when they know a lie is kinder than the truth. The ground trembled. Voss lifted his head. Incoming. We scrambled to positions, gripping empty rifles and blunt bayonets like they were lifelines. The fog thickened, turning shapes into shadows. The distant chanting grew louder, closer, like a river of death rushing toward us. Then I heard the sound that marked the start of a hopeless fight, the clatter of boots stumbling through the mud, as another squad fell back past our trench, eyes wide, weapons empty. "No ammo?" Ralvan called. "Nothing!" one of them shouted. "Command says we're on our own." Karen's breath hitched. Voss spat into the mud. I looked down the line of my men, all bruised, bloodied, exhausted, and felt the weight of command crush against my ribs. We weren't holding a position. We were being offered to the enemy like kindling. And somewhere beyond the smoke, the cultists roared and surged forward again. The fog shifted just enough for me to see them coming again, those twisted silhouettes moving with feverish devotion, robes soaked in the blood of whoever they'd torn apart last. Their voices rose in a warped hymn, a sound that rattled inside my teeth and made the air feel thinner. I felt Karen tremble beside me, not from cold but from the knowledge that we had nothing left to answer them with. Not a single round, not a single charge pack, nothing but blades and desperation. Voss hefted his heavy bolter again, though it had been dry for nearly an hour. His shoulders sagged under its dead weight. "If they're gonna kill us," he muttered, "I want it known I was holding something impressive when I went." He tried to grin, but the expression fell apart before it formed. The heaviness in his eyes told the truth. He wasn't ready to die, and the realization gutted him. Ralvan stepped to the trench lip, scanning the advancing tide with slow, measured breaths. "They're massing at the left flank," he murmured, "trying to push us into the collapsed section." He tapped his finger against the hilt of his combat knife. "We need to move before we get boxed in." Move where? Every trench behind us was already overrun or obliterated. Forward meant death. Sideways meant death. Standing still merely delayed it. But Ralvan spoke the way he always did, calm, commanding, as though the world wasn't burning around him. It steadied me more than any order from command ever had. The cultists surged closer, their torchlight turning the fog into a writhing, orange smear. Someone behind me whimpered. It might have been Karen, or maybe the sound came from my own throat before I swallowed it down. I pressed my vox bead again. Command, this is Orison Squad. Enemy at trench edge. We require immediate ammo, anything you can spare. Anything at all. My voice cracked on the last word. Static hissed, long and cold. Then a single message pushed through, warped by interference, but unmistakably clear. Orison Squad hold. Ammunition prioritized for frontline armored units. Delay enemy advance as long as possible. Voss slammed his fist into the trench wall. Frontline armored units? We are the frontline. Ralvan bowed his head, just for a heartbeat. A moment of mourning for a truth finally spoken aloud. They've left us behind, he said quietly. We're the buffer. A wall made of flesh. Karen wiped at his face with shaking hands. But we held the line. We did everything right, didn't we? He looked at me like a child pleading with a parent to fix a broken toy. I wanted to lie again, but the words wouldn't come. All I could offer him was silence, and silence was worse than any truth. The first cultist reached the trench edge, a gaunt man with a flayed face and a rusted cleaver. He dropped into the mud with a wet impact. Ralvan moved without hesitation, stepping forward and driving his knife upward beneath the man's ribs. The cultist fell, screaming through torn lips. Ralvan kicked him aside just as another followed. Here they come, Voss roared, lifting his bolter like a battering ram. The trench erupted into chaos, blades flashing, bodies slamming against wet earth, the air filled with the screams of men who had run out of hope before they ran out of blood. Ralvan fought like a man who had already accepted death. Voss swung the bolter with bone-breaking force, cursing with every swing. Karen clung to my side, stabbing wildly at shadows, tears streaking down his cheeks. And all the while, the Vox repeated the same cold whisper every few minutes. Delay the enemy, delay the enemy, delay the enemy. Not hold, not survive, just delay. Just die slowly enough to make another regiment matter. Mud, blood, smoke, and terror swallowed us whole as the cultists poured in. And in that moment, the moment I felt the last sliver of belief in our command flicker out, I understood the truth. They had never intended to save us. We were already dead. We just hadn't stopped breathing yet. The moment the first cultist's blood splashed across my visor, hot and slick, I realized what kind of battle this had become. It wasn't a defense. It wasn't a stand. It wasn't even war. It was slaughter, slow, deliberate, sanctioned slaughter, and we were its designated offering. Ralvan shoved another attacker back with the heel of his palm, driving his knife into the man's throat with practiced precision. Fall inward, he shouted over the roar. Collapse the line toward the reserve trench. But there was no reserve trench, just craters filled with water and bodies, and the faint glow of burning Prometheum tanks we'd never reach. Karen clung to my side, breath coming in ragged gasps as he stabbed his bayonet into a cultist's gut. The blade caught on bone, and he yanked it free with a broken sob. Sarge, I'm out, I can't. You're not. Out, I said, gripping his shoulder. You're still standing. The words felt hollow, but I needed him to believe them. I needed someone to believe something, because the nails of fear and exhaustion were burrowing deep into all of us. Voss let out a roar and swung his heavy bolter like a club, the weapon crunching into a cultist's jaw with a horrible crack. Blood sprayed across the trench wall, mixing instantly with the mud. "Emperor, take them!" he bellowed, though we all knew the Emperor wasn't listening. Not here, not now, not to us. The cultists surged again, their chants merging into a rising howl. I lifted my lasgun just out of instinct, clicked the trigger, click, click, click. The sound dug into my spine. That was all I had left. Clicks. I hit the Vox. Command. Orison Squad. Ammo is out. Repeat. Ammo is out. We have wounded. We have no support, requesting immediate. Static swallowed my words. Then a voice slid through, cold and distant. Negative resupply. Ammunition reserved for units of proven strategic value. Hold position. The words slammed into me harder than any shell. Ralvan froze mid-strike. Voss turned, eyes wide. Keren shook his head slowly. Strategic. Value? Another voice cut in same cold tone, same dispassion. Lives may be expended, ammunition may not. I felt something inside me tear a clean, quiet break. Not anger, not fear, something colder. A realization that settled into my bones like frost. We weren't soldiers, we weren't defenders, we were obstacles. A speed bump in a war too large to care about us. The cultists hit the trench again before I could speak. Ralvan moved like a man running on memory alone, slicing through flesh with mechanical precision. Voss slammed his bolter into a man's ribcage until both the weapon and the ribs cracked. Keren stumbled, fell, and I hauled him upright before the next blade could reach him. "Back!" I shouted. "Fall back now." We climbed over the bodies at our feet, Imperial and traitor alike, and stumbled into the secondary trench, little more than a line of half-collapsed boards buried in mud. The air was thicker here, the smoke choking. Somewhere in the fog, a man screamed until he didn't. Ralvan pulled Keren into cover, checking his wounds with hands that shook just slightly. "He's hit," he muttered. "I'm fine," Keren gasped, though his leg bled freely through the torn fabric. "I can still fight." I nodded. "You will." Voss spat mud and wiped blood from his eyes. "What now, Sarge? What do we do with no ammo and no orders except die slowly?" I didn't answer immediately. My mind raced through every tactical diagram I'd ever memorized, every fallback plan drilled into me since conscription. None of them fit a situation where command refused to acknowledge our existence. "We hold as long as we can," I finally said. "We make them bleed for every step." Ralvan nodded. Keren clenched his jaw. Voss growled a curse. But deep inside, beneath all the layered lies and hopeful delusions, I understood the truth. We weren't fighting to win. We were fighting because someone far above us had decided our deaths bought them time. The cultists moved in the fog like shadows made of teeth. Ralvan tightened his grip on his knife. Voss steadied his bolter club. Keren whispered a prayer through trembling lips. And I, Sergeant Hale, stood between them and the darkness, knowing command had already carved our names into the grave. The fog carried their footsteps, first dull thuds in the mud, irregular but innumerable. Then their chanting, rising in a warbling crescendo like a choir of broken souls, each voice twisted by devotion to something foul and hungry. Every syllable vibrated in the boards beneath my boots. I had heard these chants for days, but now, stripped of ammunition, they sounded different. Louder, closer, certain. We crouched low behind a post, mangled section of trench wall, breaths sharp and cold in the air. Keren's leg bled through the makeshift bandage Ralvan had wrapped around it, soaking the cloth in a spreading dark patch. He clenched his jaw hard enough to crack a tooth, trying not to whimper, trying not to slow us down. Too young to die here. Too young to see what it meant to be abandoned. Ralvan crouched beside him, one hand pressed to the boy's shoulder. "Stay focused. You're still with us." His voice was soft, steady like a father soothing a frightened child, though none of us would ever admit the comparison aloud. Voss pressed his back against the trench wall, breathing heavily. The weight of his heavy bolter, now nothing more than a metal club, seemed to drag his entire frame downward. "I'd give anything for one belt," he muttered. "Just one Emperor-forsaken belt." "You'd miss every shot anyway," Ralvan said, just loud enough for Voss to hear. A ghost of a smirk tugged at the taller man's lips. Voss snorted. "Dead cultists don't care about accuracy." For the briefest flicker, we laughed. Not because anything was funny, but because laughter kept the screaming pushed a few seconds further away. Then I heard it, the crunch of bodies underfoot, too heavy to be mud alone. Something big was moving ahead of the horde. My grip tightened around my lasgun, not because it could protect me, but because holding it made me remember when I believed it would. A dark shape loomed through the fog, Massive shoulders wrapped in chains, a crude helmet welded from scrap metal and bone. A brute, the kind of abomination forged when desperation met heresy. It dragged a hammer big enough to shatter a man in a single blow. Behind it, dozens of cultists fanned out, their torches flickering like diseased fireflies. Karen whimpered. "Emperor, they're sending everything." "Of course they are," Voss whispered. "We're cornered animals." I hit the Vox again, not because I expected an answer, but because some instinct deeper than thought refused to stop trying. "Command, Orison Squad, heavy enemy unit approaching. We can't hold this trench without resupply. We need backup, we need." The reply was immediate, calm, clipped, cruel in its indifference. "Negative. Ammunition cannot be expended on low-value positions." Low-value positions. That was us. That was all we were. A deeper part of me broke at those words. Not a crack, a severing. A quiet, irreversible cut between belief and reality. Ralvan heard it, too. He didn't look at me, didn't need to. He simply reached for his knife, flipped it in his hand, and whispered, "Then we go down on our terms." Voss's jaw flexed. "If they won't send ammo, they can at least hear us die." Karen shook his head violently. "No, no, no, there has to be something they can't just—" "They can," Ralvan said softly. "And they already have." The brute roared, a sound like thunder forced through torn lungs, and charged. I grabbed Karen and pulled him behind me just as the monster slammed into the trench wall, sending planks flying in a rain of splinters. Voss tackled the thing with the last of his strength, swinging the bolter club into its armored skull. The brute backhanded him across the trench, the impact echoing like a cannon shot. "Voss!" I shouted, but I had no time to reach him. Another wave of cultists leapt into the trench, screaming, clawing, swinging rusted blades. The world became a maelstrom of mud, blood, and choking breath. Ralvan stabbed one in the throat, spun, and kicked another into the brute's path. Karen clung to my arm, stabbing blindly with his bayonet, his tears indistinguishable from the rain. The Vox crackled again. Same voice, same tone, as though reading a weather report. "Continue delaying the enemy advance." I stared up at the shattered sky, rage and despair tangled in my chest. We weren't soldiers anymore. We were sandbags, meant to be filled with blood. The brute's hammer slammed into the mud beside me, spraying filth across my visor. If the blow had been an inch closer, I would have been paced. Karen screamed behind me, scrambling backward on hands and knees, dragging his wounded leg through the muck. The cultists pressed in from all sides, shrieking their devotion to whatever filth they worshipped, their blades catching what little light still filtered through the smoke-filled sky. I lunged forward, driving my shoulder into the brute's ribs. It was like hitting a wall built from meat and iron. The creature barely staggered, but the moment of imbalance gave Ralvan the chance he needed. He leapt, slamming his knife deep into the brute's exposed armpit. Blood poured out in thick, black ropes. The monster roared and swung wildly, smashing Ralvan off like he was made of feathers. "Ralvan!" I shouted, but my voice drowned in the din. The sergeant crashed into the trench wall, sliding down with a wet gasp. The brute turned toward him, raising its blood-soaked hammer. I didn't have time to think. I didn't have time to feel. I grabbed the nearest corpse's lasgun empty and swung the stock straight into the brute's jaw. The bone cracked. The brute reeled. Ralvan crawled away, coughing blood. "Up!" I barked, grabbing his arm. "Move!" He forced himself to his feet, one hand pressed to his chest, breath rattling. "I'm fine," he lied, and even Karen, sobbing behind us, knew it. Voss dragged himself upright farther down the trench, using the heavy bolter as a crutch. Blood streamed from his temple. Sarge, I can't. See straight." He stumbled, collapsed to one knee, tried to stand again. The cultists surged forward, stepping over their dead with blind eagerness. One lunged for Karen. I spun, slamming my forearm into the attacker's throat, then driving his head into the trench wall. Bone buckled. He fell. Another replaced him instantly. Ralvan grabbed Karen, pulling him into a small indentation behind the collapsed support beams. "Stay behind me," he growled. Kerin shook, clutching his bayonet like a lifeline. "We're going to die here, aren't we?" I wanted to tell him no. I wanted to promise him rescue. But the words wouldn't form, not after what Command had said, not after hearing my squad labeled low value. A cultist lunged at Voss, ragged hair, wild eyes. Voss swung the heavy bolter weakly. The cultist dodged easily and drove a rusted blade into his side. Voss gasped. The world seemed to pause. "No," Kerin screamed. "I didn't think I just moved." I tackled the cultist, punching until his face turned bone white under the blood. My fists kept falling long after he stopped twitching. The nails of desperation were in me now, grinding reason into dust. Voss slumped forward, coughing wetly. "Sarge, don't let me die, down in the mud like this." But there was no Medicae, no bandages, no hope. I pressed my forehead to his. "I'm here. I'm with you." His breath shuddered once, then stopped. Kerin broke, sobbing into Ralvan's shoulder. Ralvan didn't look away from Voss's body. His jaw clenched so tightly blood leaked from his gums. "They sent us to die," he whispered. "They sent us here to die without bullets, so they wouldn't have to record the cost." The brute roared again. The trench shook under its steps as it charged, knocking aside its own cultists. Ralvan pushed Kerin behind me and stepped forward, knife clenched. "Hail, we make this count." "For what?" I asked, breath ragged. He didn't hesitate. "For each other." The brute slammed into us, and the world became violence. Ralvan's knife found its throat. My boot found its knee. Kerin screamed my name. Mud swallowed my legs. Smoke burned my lungs. Blood mine, Ralvan's. The brute splattered the wall. When it finally fell, the trench grew eerily silent. No cheering, no reinforcement. Just the sound of distant artillery and the quiet drip of blood from my knuckles. And in that suffocating silence, listening to Kerin's soft sobs and Ralvan's labored breaths, I understood what Command had truly meant. We weren't defending the Imperium, we were delaying our own deaths. The brute's corpse steamed in the cold air, its blood pooling in sluggish rivulets that crawled through the mud like dark veins. For a moment, a thin, fragile moment, the trench fell quiet enough for me to hear my own heartbeat. Kerin's sobs softened into shivers. Ralvan leaned heavily on the trench wall, dragging breath into his broken ribs, one painful rasp at a time. And I stood in the center, lasgun hanging dead from my fingers, the weight of Command crushing harder than the brute's hammer ever could. "Move," Ralvan rasped. "We can't stay here." His voice trembled at the edges, but the core of it, the part forged in wars long before this one, still held. He nodded to the right, where a narrow tunnel dipped beneath the trench line. Secondary dugout, maybe 50 meters. I knelt beside Voss, pressing my hand to his cooling cheek. His eyes were half open, staring at the bruise-colored sky. I closed them gently. "Sorry," I whispered. "You deserved better." Kerin's voice shook. "We all do." He tried to stand, but collapsed instantly as pain shot through his wounded leg. Ralvan caught him under the arm and hauled him up with a grunt. "Lean on me. Keep pressure on that bandage." "It won't stop bleeding," Kerin choked out. Ralvan's jaw tightened. "I know." We started moving slow, dragging steps, the kind made by men more dead than alive. Every breath tasted like smoke and iron. The trench walls leaned inward as if trying to bury us early. I forced myself forward, one foot after another, keeping my weapon raised, though I knew it was little, more than a stick now. The dugout tunnel was half collapsed, its entrance choked with broken planks. I kicked them aside and gestured the others in. The space inside was barely wide enough for 3 bodies. A single flickering lumen strip cast a sickly yellow light over the stacked crates, empty, every one of them. Emptiness had become the Imperium's greatest supply. Kerin slumped against the far wall, clutching his leg. "Sarge, are we safe here?" His voice was small, too small for the trenches. Safe. The word felt obscene. We're hidden. I said. That's enough. Ralvan lowered himself opposite Keren with a wince. Blood seeped through the tears in his armor. He rested his head back, eyes half closed. Command won't send anyone. You know that. I know. Saying it aloud tasted like rot. Keren looked between us, panic rising. But they have to. We held the line. We did everything right. Ralvan cut him off gently. Keren, stop. The Tekking boy's breath hitched, and he pressed his trembling hands to his face. I knelt beside him, placing a steady hand on his shoulder. You're alive, I told him. That's what matters now. His eyes met mine wide, frightened, desperate for a future he no longer believed existed. And for the first time since the war began, he whispered what we were all thinking. Sarge, are we going to die here? I didn't lie this time. I didn't have the strength. I don't know, I said. But if we do it together. Keren nodded slowly, breathing in ragged gulps, trying to swallow his fear. Ralvan watched us with hollow eyes. He wasn't afraid of dying. He was afraid of failing us before it came. Minutes passed, maybe more, maybe less. Time bled strangely in the dugout, swaying like the hanging lumen that flickered with every distant explosion. The earth trembled above us as the cultists reorganized, their chants echoing faintly through the ground. We were buried beneath a world that had already tried to kill us a dozen times today. Ralvan finally broke the silence. We need weapons. Anything, even a pipe. I nodded, dragging a crate toward me. Empty. Another, empty. The third had a single entrenching spade, rusty, its edge warped. I held it up. Best we've got. Ralvan managed a grim smile. Then you'll make it count. Before I could answer, the ground above us shook violently, a muffled roar, then muffled screams. The cultists were pushing again. The trench system groaned under the pressure of battle, dust falling in thin veils from the ceiling. Keren's eyes widened. They found the entrance. Ralvan pushed himself upright, gripping his knife. Then we hold this spot. I wrapped my fingers around the spade's handle. Its weight was pathetic compared to a lasgun, but in the dark, under the earth, surrounded by the wounded and the dying, it felt like the last honest weapon I'd ever wield. Because out there, command had abandoned us, but in here, in this hole in the earth, we still had each other. The dugout shook again hard enough that dirt sifted down from the ceiling in a brown curtain. Keren flinched, curling inward as though the earth itself meant to crush him. Ralvan braced a hand on the wall, blood dripping steadily from a gash beneath his ribs. I could see the pain blazing in his eyes, but he refused to bow to it. None of us had that luxury anymore. They're searching the tunnels, he said quietly. I nodded. I could hear them now, boots sloshing in the mud overhead, muffled shouts carried through the soil, metal scraping against metal as they pried open collapsed trench boards. They were thorough, the kind of thoroughness born from religious frenzy, a zeal that promised no survivor would go unnoticed. Ralvan tightened his grip on the knife. Keren clutched his bayonet as if it might save him from drowning. And I kept the spade close, its weight pitiful yet familiar. A simple tool, a soldier's companion long before lasguns ever spat fire. The tunnel's shadows flickered as the lumen strip sputtered again, casting our faces in a brief, sickly glow. That was when Keren's breath caught suddenly, sharp as a gasp of pain. Sarge, he whispered, voice trembling. Did you hear that? I froze. For a heartbeat, there was only the distant thud of boots and the soft hiss of falling dirt. Then a soft murmur, a voice, a familiar voice, Voss. My blood turned to ice. It wasn't possible. Voss was dead. I'd held his cooling body. I'd felt the last breath leave him. But the voice came again, muffled, broken, but unmistakably his. Sarge, help me. Keren pressed himself against the wall, shaking violently. He's alive, he whispered. Emperor Sarge, he's alive. No, Ralvan said firmly. No, he's not. The voice echoed again, closer this time. Sarge, why did you leave me? Keren whimpered and covered his ears. Stop. Please stop. Ralvan leaned closer, his face pale. It's not him. The cultists mimic. They use the dead to lure the living. It was true. I knew it. I'd seen it before on Durnell Ridge, when the traitors carved vox grates into their throats to mimic the dying. But knowing didn't ease the way my hands trembled. Didn't ease the way my throat tightened at the sound of my friend's voice begging me not to abandon him again. Sarge. Karen sobbed. Make it stop. Then another voice joined the first. Ralvan's. Not the one sitting beside me. A different version, raw, agonized, whispering through the dirt like a corpse refusing to rest. Hail. I can't hold. Don't let us go alone. Ralvan stiffened, jaw clenched tight. That's not me, he said through his teeth. That's them. I squeezed the spade until the wooden handle creaked. The voices grew louder, overlapping, bleeding into one. Another voice, Ralvan, even Karen's own voice whispered back at him through the walls, pleading for help, whimpering his name. The cultists outside weren't searching anymore. They were hunting. Karen broke first. He lunged toward the entrance, dragging his wounded leg behind him. I have to help him. I can't leave Voss out there, I can't. Ralvan grabbed him, wrestling him back. That's not Voss. Karen, look at me. But the boy thrashed wildly, sobbing, the illusion ripping at whatever strength he had left. I won't let him die alone again, let me go. Stay with us. I barked, stepping forward. The voices crescendoed, filling the dugout until it felt like the earth itself was screaming. Sarge, help. Hail. Don't leave me. Karen, save me. Ralvan pinned Karen against the wall. Listen to me. They're using your fear, but fear was all any of us had left. I stepped closer, lowering my voice to a whisper. Karen, look at me. His eyes lifted wet, terrified, desperate. Voss is dead, I said softly, and the only people left for you to save are in this room. Something in him cracked, not broken, but released. He collapsed, sobbing into his hands, and Ralvan eased him down gently. That was when the voices stopped. Dead silence fell heavy and unnatural. Ralvan's eyes narrowed, they're right outside. As if confirming his words, a shadow passed over the entrance, then another. Then a low, gurgling laugh. The cultists had found us. I lifted the spade. Ralvan raised his knife. Karen clung to his bayonet with trembling hands. They're coming, I whispered. Ralvan nodded. Then we fight. Because we had nothing left except each other and the tools we held. The first cultist dropped into the dugout like a sack of meat, landing on hands and knees with a guttural snarl. His eyes glowed with fevered madness, pupils blown wide with whatever filth he worshipped. Before he could rise, I stepped forward and swung the spade downward with every ounce of strength left in my body. The edge cracked into his skull with a wet, splintering crunch. He twitched once, then stilled. The sound echoed through the narrow chamber like a hammer striking bone china, brittle and final. Karen whimpered behind me, his breath stuttering. Ralvan shifted into a defensive stance, knife reversed in his hand, chest heaving with shallow, painful breaths. A second shadow blotted out the entrance, then a third. They weren't rushing in. They were savoring the wait. Cultists loved fear. They wanted us to drown in it first. I planted my feet, raising the spade again. My arms trembled not with fear, but exhaustion so deep it seeped into the marrow of my bones. Ralvan's voice reached me softly. Hail, we hold no matter what comes through that hole. I nodded, swallowing the dryness in my throat. Together. Karen crawled closer, dragging his gaunt, injured leg, wiping tears from his muddied face. I'll fight too, Sarge. I won't run. You don't need to run, I said. Just stay behind us, stay alive. Another cultist lunged in, blade raised. Ralvan intercepted, slamming him into the wall so hard the boards groaned. He drove his knife into the cultist's throat, twisted, and shoved the body aside. But the effort made him sag forward, a grimace carving deep into his bruised face. He was fading. We both knew it. A third cultist scrambled in immediately after, trying to step over the fallen body. I swung the spade sideways, catching him across the jaw. His teeth shattered in a spray of red and white. He choked on them as he fell. Voices hissed from the tunnel entrance, too many to count. The lumen overhead flickered, casting the dugout into stuttering shadows. Every time it blinked, new shapes appeared above, as if forming from the darkness itself. They were waiting for us to weaken. Ralvan braced, himself against the wall. Blood soaked through his armor in long, glistening rivers. He tried to take a step forward but nearly collapsed. "Sit," I commanded. "I can still..." "Sit." My voice was sharper than I intended, but he obeyed, teeth clenched in silent defiance of his own collapsing strength. Keren moved beside him, gripping his bayonet with trembling determination. "Sarge, they'll overrun us. There's too many." "I know," I said. The truth hung heavy in the cramped air. We were going to die here. The only question was how long we could hold before they tore us apart. A fourth cultist crawled in slowly, deliberately. His face was painted with blood and ash, his eyes unfocused, yet fixed on me with dreadful clarity. He wasn't rushing. He wanted to savor it. He whispered, voice cracking like dry wood, "The weak are meat." I didn't let him finish. I stepped forward and drove the spade into his sternum. He collapsed with a gurgling sigh. My breath came in ragged gasps. My arms burned. My vision blurred at the edges. Ralvan's breathing grew shallow, rasping, wet, strained. Keren whispered prayers under his breath, the words trembling like shattered glass. Outside the dugout, more cultists shuffled, shivered, murmured. They weren't scattering, they were gathering, waiting for the moment when we couldn't lift our weapons anymore. Ralvan coughed blood. "Hail, listen to me." "No," I said quickly. "We're not there yet." "We are," he insisted, his eyes bloodshot and fading, fixed on mine with desperate calm. "When they come again, when they break through, you take Keren and run." Keren's head jerked. No, I'm not leaving." "You run," Ralvan repeated, voice rough as gravel, "or they'll hang your skulls from the trench walls." I wanted to argue. I wanted to promise him an escape, a miracle, anything. But no miracle had come, no help, no ammo, no rescue. All we had was time. And time was nearly gone. A heavy thud struck the boards above us, dust drifting like funeral ash. More scraping, more whispers, more steps. Ralvan closed his eyes briefly, lips moving silently, some last thought or memory, destined to die with him. Keren grabbed my arm, terrified. "Sarge, what do we do?" I raised the spade again, planting myself between them and the darkness. "We hold," I whispered. "We hold until the world stops," because that was all that remained. The boards above us gave way with a groaning crack, and a cascade of mud and splintered timber rained down. Keren yelped and shielded his wounded leg. Ralvan gritted his teeth, forcing himself upright again despite the tremor running through his limbs. The lumen flickered once, twice, then died entirely, plunging the dugout into a suffocating darkness that swallowed breath and thought alike. I tightened my grip on the spade. The metal was slick with blood, mine, theirs. Someone's, and the wood handle felt soft now, soaked through by the trench's filth. Every part of me ached. Every part of me screamed. But pain was a luxury I didn't have the strength to feel anymore. "Stay behind me," I whispered, reaching back until my hand brushed Keren's trembling shoulder. He nodded, even though he knew I couldn't see it. His breathing came in panicked, uneven pulls wet from tears, wet from fear. Ralvan's breath, by contrast, had gone slow, too slow, a soft rasp beside me. "Hail, how many are left?" I listened. Outside, the broken boards overhead, I could hear them. Boots sliding through mud, metal scraping stone, ragged breaths tinged with fervor. A low, expectant, murmuring the prelude to a slaughter. "Dozens," I said. "Maybe more." Ralvin gave a breath that was almost a laugh. Too many for knives. Not enough to stop us. He was lying, and we both knew it. The first cultist slithered into the dark like a feral animal. I felt him before I saw him, a shift in the air, a change in the pressure around us. I swung the spade instinctively. The impact shuddered through my arms, followed by a gurgling choke and a collapse of weight. Karen whimpered. "Sarge, I can't see." "You don't need to see," I said. "Just hold your knife tight." Another shape dropped down. Ralvin moved this time. His knife found flesh with a wet crunch, followed by a hiss of pain from his own lips as he struggled to hold himself upright. "You're hurt," I murmured. "You're slower," he answered faintly. "Let's call it even." The ground above us trembled again, more bodies shifting, more hands gripping the ledge. I felt the hairs rise on the back of my neck. "They're coming in waves," I whispered. Karen pressed his forehead against the wall. "We're going to die." "We already should have," Ralvin said. His voice was quieter now, dimming like the lumen that had just died. "But dying isn't the part that scares me." "What scares you?" Karen asked. "Dying alone." Silence hugged us close for a breath. My throat tightened. "We're still here," I said softly. "All three of us." The next cultist dropped down, this one larger, heavier. Ralvin pushed off the wall, knife raised, but his knees buckled mid-step. I surged forward in his place, slamming the spade into the attacker's face. Bone crunched. The cultist staggered, clawed blindly, then fell. Ralvin leaned against the wall, panting. "Hail. If one of us falls, we don't fall," I said sharply. "Hail, we don't fall." He let out a thin breath through clenched teeth. Above us, torches flickered through the broken boards, casting shifting patterns across the mud. A chant rose low and rhythmic, building with each syllable. The cultists were preparing for a final push, a flood meant to drown the last embers of resistance. Karen's sobs grew quieter, tighter, almost silent. The fear in him had choked itself, replaced by something colder. Resignation. "Sarge," he whispered, "I don't want to die scared." I moved closer, placing a hand on the back of his neck, firm, steady, human. "Then don't die angry, die fighting, die remembering who you stood beside." A beat of silence, then a nod. Outside, a roar shook the ground. The cultists surged. The first one through, I struck so hard the spade's handle split. The second, I slammed into the dirt. Ralvin grabbed a third, dragging him down and stabbing wildly even as his strength sputtered out. Karen fought from behind us, slashing at shadows, crying out with each desperate thrust. Bodies piled, breaths thinned, darkness deepened, and slowly, inevitably, they started to overwhelm us. Ralvin fell first, collapsing to his knees, still gripping his knife. "Hail," he whispered. "Don't let Karen." His voice faded. His body slumped. His knife fell from limp fingers. I turned just in time to catch him before he hit the ground fully. Karen's scream tore through the dugout. "No. Ralvin, no." I held Ralvin in my arms as the cultists closed in, shadows crowding the narrow space. "We're not dead yet," I said, but even I couldn't believe it anymore. Ralvin's weight sagged fully into my arms, heavier than armor, heavier than all the lies we'd been told. His blood soaked through my gloves, warm for only a moment before the cold air stole the heat from it. Karen crawled toward us, dragging his wounded leg, his hands shaking so violently he left streaks of mud across his face as he reached for Ralvin's shoulder. Ralvin, stay with us please. Don't leave us." His voice cracked, splintering like glass under a boot. Ralvin's eyelids fluttered. His gaze struggled to hold focus on Karen's face. "Karen, you did well," he whispered, breath catching in his throat. "You did more than anyone had a right to ask." The boy shook his head in denial, even as tears spilled freely. No, I didn't. I couldn't. I should have." "Stop," Ralvin rasped. "You stood. That's enough." The dugout trembled again, shadows shifting above us as more cultists gathered at the entrance, their hungry murmurs swelling like a rising tide. We didn't have long. Ralvan knew it. Keren knew it. And I had known it for hours. The only difference now was that death was no longer a possibility. It was marching toward us, one broken hymn at a time. I lowered Ralvan gently to the dirt, resting his back against the wall. His breaths came short and wet, each one a struggle. "Hail," he murmured. I leaned closer. "I'm here." He swallowed hard, blood mixing with saliva. "Take him. If there's a way out, take Keren, even if it kills you." "There is no way out," I whispered, the truth sharp enough to cut skin. Ralvan gave a faint, broken smile. "Then, make one." His head fell back. His chest rose once, twice, then stopped. Keren let out a sound I don't have a word for. A wail, a fracture, a boy shattering in the dark. The cultists above us cheered at the sound. I rose slowly, gripping the broken spade in both hands. My arms trembled, but not from fear, from the sheer exhaustion of a man who has nothing left inside him but the shape of duty carved into bone. "We can't stay here," I said quietly. Keren wiped at his face with shaking hands. "Where do we go?" His voice was barely sound, more breath than speech. "Up," I said. "Through them." His eyes widened with terror. "Sarge, that's suicide." "It's survival," I said. "And survival always looks like suicide until it isn't." A board above us cracked, and a cultist dropped down halfway, hanging by one elbow, reaching toward Keren with rusted nails. I swung the spade up, crushing his fingers. He shrieked and fell backward into the trench. More voices rose in response. More shadows gathered. More scraping metal. More anticipation. They had smelled weakness. Keren crawled to Ralvan's body, pressed his forehead against Ralvan's cold brow, and whispered something I couldn't hear, something meant for dead ears, for a dead man who deserved far better than a hole in the ground. Then he wiped his eyes, grabbed his bayonet, and nodded at me. A small nod, a broken nod, but a brave one. I moved to the ladder of dirt and splintered wood that led upward, toward the faint glow of enemy torches. "Keren," I said softly. He looked up. "When we hit the surface, do not stop. Do not look back. If I fall, you run." He clenched his jaw. "And if I fall?" I tightened my grip on the spade. "Then I carry you." The boy tried to smile. It didn't reach his eyes. We climbed. The cultists saw us the second our heads broke the lip of the trench. Their screams rose not in fury, but in exhilaration, like wolves seeing prey stagger into the open. They surged toward us, blades trembling with hunger. I met the first one with the dull end of the spade, cracking his jaw sideways. Keren stabbed another through the stomach. The third slammed into me, knocking me into the mud. The fourth tried to drag Keren down into the trench with him. The world spun in a blur of dirt and blood and broken breath. But we made it out of the dugout alive. For now, the world above the dugout was worse than the dark we'd crawled out of. Smoke churned across the trench line in thick, choking waves, and the ground was carpeted with bodies ours. Theirs. Men without faces, men drowning in mud. The sky flickered with distant artillery, pale flashes that lit the battlefield like the slow, dying pulse of some wounded god. Keren staggered beside me, dragging his leg through the sludge, breath hitching with every step. We didn't run. We couldn't. There was nowhere to run to. The trench stretched ahead, winding like a torn vein through a corpse. What few boards remained were snapped or burning, and the cultists were everywhere, scrambling over the walls, crawling from shell craters, rising from piles of the dead like rot-made flesh. Keren pressed closer, eyes darting through the smoke. "Sarge, where do we go? Where do we go?" I didn't answer. I didn't know. The maps we'd memorized were meaningless now. The trench system had collapsed under hours of fire and frenzy. Command had cut the line. Reinforcements had been diverted. We were fighting inside a corpse that hadn't realized it was dead yet. A screaming cultist rushed us from the right, swinging a hooked blade. I pushed Keren aside and blocked with the spade. The impact jolted through my arms, sending a burst of sparks into my vision. The blade nicked my shoulder, tearing fabric and skin. I swung again, smashing the spade into his temple. He fell without a sound. Keren stared, wide-eyed. "How are you? Still fighting?" "Because you are," I said simply. We kept moving, stepping over broken helmets and severed limbs. Keren stumbled when his foot hit a fallen guardsman. He froze, staring at the corpse as though seeing himself in that slumped, empty shell. Was he one of ours?" he whispered. "No." Yes. It didn't matter anymore. The dead no longer had names. He reached down and grabbed the fallen trooper's combat knife, hands shaking. "I won't die with an empty blade," he said, forcing steadiness into his voice. The boy was growing older by the minute. War does that. Betrayal finishes the job. A distant roar shook the trench. More cultists surged from the smoke, a tide of ragged silhouettes. Some screamed scripture. Some laughed. Some were silent, their devotion carved into the slack coldness of their faces. Keren's breathing hitched. His fingers clutched the knife too tightly, turning his knuckles bloodless. "Sarge, I can't, there's too many." "I know," I whispered. The first cultist reached him. Keren stabbed wildly, the blade catching ribs. The man shrieked. Keren stabbed again, and again, each thrust more desperate than the last, as if removing one life could somehow pay the debt of them all. I turned and fought off the others, spade rising and falling, each strike sending mud and blood flying. My arms felt numb, my vision narrowed to a small tunnel of red and breath and motion. But I kept moving. Then the inevitable happened. Keren slipped. One cultist's blade slashed across his side. He cried out a thin, despairing sound and fell to his knees. The attacker lunged for him, and I moved faster than thought, grabbing the cultist by the collar and throwing him into the trench wall with brutal force. I dropped beside Keren, pulling him upright. Blood poured from the gash along his ribs. His breath came in quick, panicked gulps. "Sarge," he whispered, voice cracking. It hurts so much." "I know," I said, pressing my hand to the wound. "Stay with me." The battlefield around us grew distant, just noise, just shapes. Keren's gaze flickered. "I don't want to die." "You're not dying." Another lie. But this one tasted like mercy. The roar of cultists grew louder. More shadows closed in. I stood, placing myself between Keren and the descending tide. There was nothing left to use but the spade's broken handle and my fists. I felt something break inside me, not bone, not muscle, but something quieter. That last, stubborn flame of belief that the Imperium might still come for us, that someone might care. No one came. No one ever had. When the cultists hesitated a moment, just long enough for me to register the gap, I realized why. I was the last one still standing. The last one worth killing. The last one left to forget. I stepped forward, raising the splintered spade handle, and whispered maybe to Keren, maybe to Ralvan, maybe to the forgotten dead beneath the mud. "I'm still here." And the world, as if offended by my persistence, surged to correct that mistake. They broke against me like waves against a dying shoreline, each impact stealing breath, strength, and pieces of myself I didn't know could still be taken. The world faded into a series of blows, shrieking faces, flailing blades, mud splashing against my visor, blood soaking into the broken handle of the spade until it felt heavier than steel. I fought without thinking, without seeing, each motion slower than the last, each breath tighter, each heartbeat louder in my ears. But in the end, it wasn't a blade that brought me down. It was exhaustion pure and absolute. My knees buckled, dropping me into the mud. A cultist's boot slammed into my shoulder, rolling me onto my back. Another pressed a blade to my chest, chanting some guttural hymn. I stared up through the smoke, watching the sky flicker with distant fire. So much darkness. So little left worth saving. Then gunfire. Not lasfire. Stub rounds, sharp and percussive. The cultists recoiled. One fell beside me, half his skull gone. Another spun, collapsing in a heap. I twisted, vision swimming, and saw them silhouettes in rebreathers and heavy flak coats, storm lanterns strapped to their shoulders, rifles barking with disciplined precision. Not command, not rescuers, just another squad trying to push through the trench line. "Clear the bodies," someone barked. Rough hands grabbed me, dragging me back against the trench wall. My head lolled to the side, spotting Keren's limp form where I'd left him. A trooper stepped toward him, weapon raised. "No," I croaked, voice raw. "He's with me." The trooper paused, then nodded once. They checked Keren's pulse, shook their head, covered his face with a torn scrap of cloak. I forced myself upright. My muscles screamed. My vision pulsed. But I stood. Somehow, I stood. One of the storm-coated soldiers turned to me. "Sergeant Hale, right?" I blinked. "How? How do you know my name?" "We found your call sign markers. You were listed KIA. KIA. Killed in action. Already dead, according to the Imperium." The trooper continued. "Command assumed your position was overrun. They redirected all ammunition to the active lines." I swallowed the bitterness rising in my throat. They left us to die. The trooper didn't deny it, didn't apologize, just said, "Orders, orders." The word tasted like rusted iron. I looked back toward the dugout entrance, toward the bodies of Ralvan and Keren buried beneath the shadows. Their faces wouldn't be found, their names wouldn't be spoken, their deaths wouldn't matter, not here. Not to anyone who had the power to stop it. The trooper tapped my arm. "We're pulling back to the secondary trench. Whole front is collapsing. You can still walk?" I nodded. Barely. My legs trembled with every step as we moved, through the ruin of what once was a defensive line. Shell holes brimmed with rainwater and corpses. Sandbags slumped like rotting flesh. A lasgun burned faintly beside a severed hand, its power pack blinking a dying red. The stench of promethium, copper, and smoke clung to everything. A world dying by inches. The trooper glanced at me. "Anyone else with you?" Images flickered behind my eyelids. Voz, smiling with half his teeth missing. Ralvan reading maps by lantern light, Keren laughing nervously as he tried to keep up. "Everyone else is gone," I said quietly. He nodded solemnly. "Emperor keeps them." I didn't answer. I didn't dare speak the truth twisting inside my chest, that if the Emperor kept them, he had done so by taking them violently, painfully, alone. As we reached the next trench line, artillery thundered in the distance, heavy, relentless bombardment. A fresh barrage falling on the ground we had bled for. The trooper beside me muttered, "They're cleansing the entire sector." My breath hitched. Cleansing, as if the ground itself were an infection. Command had written us off long before the first cultist ever reached our line. I turned back one last time, letting my gaze settle on the smoke-shrouded place where Keren and Ralvan had died, my brothers, my burden, my ghosts. The trench crackled with firelight, then disappeared beneath the next wave of shellfire. They were gone, truly gone, erased without ceremony. And I walked away, the last man who remembered them. The secondary trench was quieter in the way graveyards are. The soldiers around me moved with the slow, stunned precision of men who had seen too much, heard too much, felt too much torn out of them in too little time. Their faces were streaked with soot, blood, and numb resignation. I matched their pace, though every step felt like I was dragging the weight of the dead behind me. A medic approached, reaching for my arm. "Sit, you're bleeding." I shook him off gently. "Save it for someone who can be saved." He hesitated. "You sure?" "No," but I nodded anyway. He moved on. The trench wall beside me shuddered as another artillery strike fell somewhere behind us, somewhere close to where Ralvan and Keren lay. Each impact was a punctuation mark in a sentence the Imperium had already written. "The dead are spent. Move the living forward." Forward to where? Forward to what? Forward for whom? The trooper who dragged me out approached again, offering a canteen. I forced a sip down, though it tasted like metal and smoke. "You should report to command," he said. "They'll want a debrief." My throat tightened. "Will they?" He didn't answer. He didn't have to. Command wasn't interested in the truth. They were interested in numbers. Survivors. 1 expendables. All the rest. I leaned against the trench wall, letting the weight of my armor press me deeper into the cold dirt. My fingers still clenched the side, broken handle of the spade. I hadn't realized I'd been carrying it. The blood on it was dark now, almost black. Kerin's blood, Ralvan's blood, mine. The trooper eyed the spade. You kill many with that. I swallowed hard. Enough. Someone up top will want your report, he said. They'll build a new line. They'll send fresh regiments. Fight continues. Fight continues. Of course it did. The fight always continued. It just never continued for the same people. I stared down the trench, endless, broken, filled with soldiers I didn't know, faces that blurred together. Then I felt something under my boot. I looked down. A torn scrap of cloth, Imperial issue, soaked in mud. I recognized the stitching. Ralvan's regiment mark. It must have been carried here by the blasts, the mudslide, or pure cruel coincidence. My breath hitched as I picked it up. A piece of him. A piece of them. Something the shells hadn't erased. I tucked it into my chest plate. One of the troopers called out. Sergeant Hale, you coming? I should have answered. Should have walked forward, marched to the next command dugout, given names and numbers and lies to an officer who'd never heard of Orison's squad, but my feet refused to move. Instead, I closed my eyes. In the darkness behind my lids, I saw Kerin laughing awkwardly as he fumbled with his gear. I saw Vos shouting over the heavy bolter's roar. I saw Ralvan leaning over a map, brow furrowed, muttering strategies with that steady confidence that made even death seem negotiable. I saw them all, alive, human, mine. A sudden crack split the air, a flare shot overhead, splashing harsh white light across the trench. Shadows leapt. Men flinched. Somewhere far off, someone screamed. The war hadn't paused for my grief. It wouldn't. It never would. I opened my eyes and inhaled the burning air, filling my lungs with smoke and cold and the last ghost of whatever hope I'd once had. The trooper called again. Hale, we need to move. I'm coming, I said, though the voice didn't feel like mine. I pushed off the wall and took a step forward. Just one. The ground trembled behind me, another artillery strike falling exactly where we'd crawled out hours before, the place where Kerin and Ralvan had bled, the place where I should have died too. Fire rose into the sky like a pyre. It lit the world enough for me to see my shadow stretching long across the trench floor, thin, wavering, alone. I kept walking, one foot after the other, because there was nothing else left to do, because they couldn't walk anymore, because someone had to remember. Night settled over the trench like a burial shroud, heavy, damp, suffocating. The front quieted into that eerie, fragile stillness that only comes after slaughter, a silence made from the absence of screams rather than peace. Lanterns flickered along the trench walls, casting long, trembling shadows that crawled across the plant. Mud. Soldiers moved like ghosts, each one carrying their own dead in their eyes. I found a corner of the trench where no one bothered me. They didn't need to. I already looked like a man half gone. My body throbbed with every heartbeat, each pulse a reminder of what I'd lost and what I'd failed to protect. My hands wouldn't stop shaking. Not from fear, fear had burned out of me hours ago, but from the weight of memory. A weight heavier than armor, heavier than the dead brute's hammer, heavier than anything command would ever write in their reports. I sat with my back against the cold trench wall and closed my eyes. At first, there was darkness, then voices. Not the twisted mimics of the cultists, not the hollow cries from the dugout walls, but theirs. Vos, laughing through busted teeth, Ralvan muttering orders with that calm, steady clarity, Kerin practicing the litany of steady aim under his breath, messing up every third word. Echoes. Warm, human, gone. I pressed the heel of my palm into my eyes, trying to force the tears back. I couldn't. My breath trembled out of me in ragged pieces, each one cutting deeper than any blade. I remembered Kerin clutching my arm as the cultists closed in. I remembered Ralvan's last command, take him, save him. I remembered the moment the spade cracked in my grip, splintering like bone. And I remembered how only I had walked away from that hole in the earth. A shadow passed beside me. A trooper paused, studying me for a moment. "You lost people," he said quietly. "All of them," I murmured. He nodded once. "It never gets easier." He walked on. I didn't. Instead, I pulled the torn scrap of cloth from my armor, the last piece of Ralvan the war hadn't stolen, and turned it over in my fingers. The stitching was frayed, the emblem half gone, but it was his. Proof that he had lived, fought, bled. Proof that he hadn't just vanished into the mud like all the others. A gust of wind carried the distant thunder of artillery. Another sector being cleansed, no doubt. Erased, purified, rewritten. The Imperium liked its metrics neat. Casualties in tidy columns. Heroism in footnotes. Sacrifice measured in crates of ammunition and meters of ground held for fractions of an hour. But there was no column for Keren's trembling bravery. No footnote for Voz dragging his heavy bolter like a lifeline. No record of Ralvan's blood mixing with mine as he told me to run. No place for them, except here in the one soldier left to remember. I bowed my head, gripping the cloth, letting the cold night air dry the tears on my face. Somewhere beyond the trench, a horn sounded retreat or advance. I couldn't tell. It didn't matter. Orders would come, new lines would be drawn, new men would fill the gaps, and I would be pushed forward again, carrying ghosts no one asked for or wanted to hear about. I forced myself to stand. My knees buckled, but I caught myself on the trench wall. I breathed in the sharp scent of promethium, ash, and distant fire. I listened to the shifting of boots and the muttered prayers of soldiers trying to build courage from scraps. I walked. One step, then another, carrying the last piece of my squad pressed against my chest like a failing heartbeat. And as the night swallowed me, I whispered their names to the cold air, not a prayer, not a plea, just the truth. The only truth I had left. Voss, Ralvan, Keren, gone. And me, the mistake that survived. I walk because they cannot, and every step costs more than my life ever did.